Father, thanks for this wonderful place. Our hearts turn toward you and understand that in your great loving kindness, you surround us with great blessings, and how easily we just walk by them and just think, well, that was here yesterday, it'll be here tomorrow, but it's something that you've done deliberately by your hand in times and places we don't expect, and you bless us, So we recognize your loving hand in this place. We also recognize your loving hand in the people you've placed around us who are great blessings to us, the people that are here, others that aren't. It's just a great blessing we don't go looking for, but you bring to us anyway, because that's the kind of God you are. So, Lord, I pray that you turn our hearts toward you as we look at this next topic and draw us closer to you as a result of this. So thanks for bringing us here. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, on your song sheet on the back, there's a little box on the bottom left about rest. We're going to talk about rest this morning. And it's tightly connected to the passages in Ezra we're looking at in a really unusual way. And rest as a topic, quote-unquote rest, has been one of my most fascinating hobbies in Bible study anywhere. And let me just paint the picture for why, and then paint the picture for why in the Ezra passage is just extraordinary, okay? So you have a bunch of passages in that little square, and we're going to go through them one at a time. And I just want you to gain a real respect for God's issue of rest, okay? And it starts in the beginning of the Bible in Genesis 1. I'll show you the connection to Ezra in just a second. But in Genesis 2 verses 2 and 3, on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it, God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. So the first question we ask in the opening pages of the Bible, rest seems so important that God has actually has designed the cadence of his work to end in rest from the creation. From the creation. Why is that so important? I mean, does God have to rest because he's tired? No, obviously not. So why rest? Why does God rest? And it's very clear as you read further into Genesis and in Exodus that he does it for a couple reasons, but the real core reason for it becomes a mystery until you read almost the entire Bible. But it's very clear, number one, he does this as a template of life for us as well. Like if you're made in his image, if you've given your heart to him, then you'll observe the same cadence in your life. Now, why did God take the seventh day of rest after 6 days of work? We're still not sure yet, but we know that if we're his children, we'll do the same cadence. But we're not sure why yet, but there's something important about it. Because clearly, God does not need to recharge his batteries at the end of creation. He doesn't. What's that? I do. Yeah, exactly. We do. So there's something he's leading us toward that's not really obvious. So let's dig in a little bit farther, because this is it's a fascinating mystery. And it's a mystery because I say so many religions have stumbled over the idea of what the Sabbath is all about. And I don't think we fully appreciate what the Sabbath is all about. But the Sabbath really is synonymous with rest. So why? Why? Well, it's more important than you might think. If you go to the Ten Commandments, okay, that's in Exodus 20. Exodus 20 is where you can find the Ten Commandments, one of two great places. You're there, and sure enough, the Ten Commandments come down. Exodus 20, verse 8, remember the Sabbath day. That's the rest day. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Holy, by the way, means set apart. So make it different. Make it set apart from the other 6 days. Make it different. And so he goes in more detail. Verse 9, 6 days you'll labor and do all of your work. Okay, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God, and on it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. Because, why? Because, verse 11, here it comes. Because in 6 days God made heaven and earth, the sea, all that's in them, and he rested on the seventh day. So the Lord blessed the seventh day and set it apart, made it holy. So see, God set the template for that cadence in our life. So he's saying in the Ten Commandments, right alongside do not murder, he says, you need to make sure that seventh day is wholly different from all the other 6. Why? Because that's what God did when he made creation. Okay, it's still a little bit of a mystery to us, but if it's important enough to be one of the 10 Commandments, maybe we should take it serious. Maybe in God's economy of his doctrines and theology, maybe there's something that we need to elevate that we're not elevating. And it'll actually become really clear that it's a bigger deal than we think when we look at Ezra. So at the very opening of the Bible, God is in the business of seeing to it that we rest. Why? Because he rested. Why did he rest? So he could show as a model how we should also do it. Okay, so I'm just making the opening case for the fact that rest is like super important. It's as important as worshiping the one God. It's as important as not murdering. It's as important as not stealing. Resting on the seventh day is that important. Now, I keep emphasizing that we don't hold that kind of importance to it. Because, in modern day Christianity, we have so many debates about the Sabbath. Back and forth. And we do the Sabbath on Saturday. No, we do our Sabbath on Sunday. And I think in a sense we're missing the point. We're missing the point because the Sabbath isn't an issue of what your religion is like and what are your different, things you do to make your religion work, all that kind of the sacrament of what you do. But there's something about the Sabbath that we're missing because we argue about the day and we forget about the purpose, which is to bring us into rest. So the question still remains, so what is rest? Because I'm still not quite sure what rest is, but I know that in God's economy it's really important. So this is why it's been kind of a wonderful hobby for me throughout my entire believing life, is to look at this rest thing. It's a curious thing to me, this rest thing. And God is super important when he talks about it. You get past the Ten Commandments, and when you get to Leviticus, we find out that it's not just a 1 day a week thing. It's a 1 year every 7 years. What? Okay. I can deal with taking a day off work every week. Can you deal with taking off a year every 7 years? See, now the dynamic is starting to press in on you. Let me just read what it says. It's in the Bible. So Leviticus 25, that's what that is. The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, "So speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you, the land shall keep a Sabbath for the Lord." The land shall keep a Sabbath for the Lord. What, like every Saturday? Verse 3. For 6 years. For 6 years you shall sow your field, and for 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its fruits. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land. Not for you, for the land. A Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field, shall not prune your vineyard. You shall not reap what grows of itself in your harvest and gather the grapes of your undressed vine. It shall be a year of solemn rest for the land. The Sabbath of the land shall provide food for you, for yourself, and for your male and female slaves, and for your hired worker and the sojourner who lives with you, and for your cattle and the wild animals that are in the land. All its yield shall be for your food. Okay, so wait, stop the truck. Every 7 years, you don't work at all. Now, let's put this into a desperate situation thinking. If you live in an agrarian economy, what happens to you and your family if you don't plant this year? You die in most economies. No one would ever think about the fact that we need honey, we just need to take a year off this year. Let's not plant the corn. Let's not plant the barley or the wheat. We're just going to take a year off, and let's just see how it goes next year. No one would do that. No one in the world would do that. But God's saying, when you get in the land, you need to do that. For your rest? Actually, no, for the rest of the land. Well, and we know in modern agronomy, we know that you need to let fields go fallow. We understand the science of that. But this is more than just that. This is more than just that. This is a threat to your existence. Literally. It's a threat to your existence. In a lesser way, the seventh day of the week is also. Because, if you live in a land and you're growing your own crops, we have a garden in our backyard, maybe you do, and we don't rely on that garden for our existence or we would be dead, okay? Yeah. So, but in an agrarian economy, the whole family puts in effort to to grow stuff outside so you don't die. I mean, that's just the way you do it. So even on the seventh day, what if you have grasshoppers come into town, which we have right now? And they were only an 1/8 inch long about a month ago. Now they're a good 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch. I mean, what if they come in and look with licking their lips, ready to take down all of your crops or your new plants, and you realize that if they come in and they eat your plants, your children will go hungry. So do you take a Saturday off? No way. You go out there every single day and you pluck those little guys off of your plants, and you're out there being very careful about protecting your plant, being protective about how you water it, making sure they're not withering. I mean, you're very protective every single day, because in a single day your entire crop could go down. So Saturday, once a week, that's a threat. But a whole year? A whole year? Now he does say, because the question, if you're thinking like a farmer right now, the question that comes to your mind is, well, then how will we make sure we don't starve next year? And he says it in the passage. He says, the Sabbath of the land shall provide food for you. You mean even if I don't work it? Yeah. It'll provide food not just for you, but for your servants, for your hired workers, for the guests, the sojourners in your land who you're kind of providing hospitality to, for all your cattle. Also, for all the wild animals, it'll provide that are in your land. And the Sabbath itself shall be your food. So somehow he's saying, and this is a fascinating thing, somehow he's saying, you take that seventh year off, and even if you don't plant, even if you don't prune your vines, and if you got grapes, you got to prune them, if you don't do all that kind of stuff, believe it or not, when the land is resting in that Sabbath year, it will provide fully for you, even if you don't put in a lick of work the year before. What? How is that possible? Well, so you go to the Bible and you try and find passages where they did this to see the narrative about, well, how did that work out? Because he says when you go in the land, do this. They're going into the land right after this narrative. How did it work out? Was there miracles? Was there miracles like when they're in the desert and God says, here's manna for you? Did they take that year off and then miracles happened about food showing up all over the place and nobody starved? So you read the Bible and you don't find anyone doing it. You don't find anyone doing it. Anywhere. So to answer your question, how'd that work out? I don't know, because they didn't do it. Oh, no. And that brings us up to Ezra. And that's why in Ezra it provokes the issues so greatly. If you look in 2 Chronicles 36, by the way, 2 Chronicles 36 is the very, very, very last chapter of Chronicles before Ezra. It actually is the perfect historical narrative leading into Ezra. And so this is what it says in the end of that narrative before the whole Ezra story starts. 2 Chronicles 36. It's the last chapter in the Chronicles. It says, Nebuchadnezzar took into exile into Babylon those who had escaped from the sword. Early in the chapter, he talks about Nebuchadnezzar coming in and killing a lot of people. Well, the ones he didn't kill, he took them into Babylon. We've talked about that a lot. And they became servants to Nebuchadnezzar and to his sons until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia. We've seen that too. The Persian kingdom took over Babylon. And why? 21. Here we go. To fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, he was the prophet that preached to him at the time, that until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths, they would stay there. All the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. So what Jeremiah was saying, and when it says, literally in the last breath before the Ezra passage starts, is that one reason why they're in captivity to Babylon is because of the fact that they never did the 7-year Sabbaths. Ever. That we can find in the Bible. Ever. Now, wait a second. This should scare you a little bit, because we see in creation the 7 cycle. We see, with the Sabbath, the 7 cycle. Now we see the 7th year cycle. And if it was a big deal in the 10 Commandments to include the Sabbath, it's probably, wow. I'm surprised we haven't any trains yet. It's probably a big deal to do the 7-year Sabbath thing. It's probably a huge deal. In fact, so huge a deal that it was a contributing factor for why Nebuchadnezzar took them into Babylon, because they didn't let the land go fallow every 7 years. Big deal. In fact, that reason overrides all the other narratives in the Bible about why they're there. Now, previous to that, if you look at the beginning of 2 Chronicles 36, you see the problems they had. I mean, they wandered from God, right? And they really weren't doing what God had asked them to. This is the southern kingdoms. I mean, there's a whole host of I'm not following God issues. But when it came to going into Babylon, the clock was set based on how many years you did not observe the 7-year thing. So he says you'll be there for 70 years. There were 70 of those 7 years they didn't do it. So if you do the math in your head, if one of the Sabbath years that you didn't do happens every 7 years, and you're there for 70 of those, it's 490 years. Okay, it's 490 years. So, what he's basically saying here at the end of Chronicles, before Ezra starts, is they didn't do this whole 7-year rotation thing for so long. And if you do the math, because this is Nebuchadnezzar came in 586 to take them away, and you do the math, this means that all the way up to the beginning of King Saul, they never did it. Through Saul as king, they never did it. Through David as king, they never did it. Through Solomon, they never did it. And then through the split kingdom after that, they never did it. They never did it. And they stacked up 70 years that should have been put on the Sabbath. So he said, Jeremiah says, so here's the clock. We're going to let the land rest for the 70 years that you did not let it rest. And then you'll come back. And sure enough, 586, we've seen this history, 586 is when Nebuchadnezzar comes in and destroys the temple. I mean, literally destroys Solomon's temple, destroys the walls around the city so it's defenseless. And 70 years later, in 516, the temple is rebuilt and 70 years elapse between the destruction of the temple and it comes back again. But in our case about rest, I'm making a case for the fact that rest seems to be like a top-tier issue with God. Not only the Sabbath rest, but also the 7-year rest seems to be a top-tier issue, enough that they went into captivity because of it. Big deal. Now, it's just not in my top-tier list of things God's interested in, but it is. He's that interested in your rest. He's that interested in your rest that when he did creation, he used that cadence in creation to tell us something extraordinarily important about rest. So at this point in the story, you can know there's something important about rest. I might be missing it, but we know that in God's mind, it's a biggie. It's not a smallie. It's a biggie. In fact, when we talk about creation in the modern world today, what's the debate among Christians today? Was a day a day? What did it take them 24 hours to do it? Was the 6 days actually 6 days, or was it millennia? Or what do we know? We're arguing about the science of how long the week of creation took. That's what we're arguing about. Nobody's arguing about the bigger issue. Why did God decide to do creation in this 6-1 format? That's a totally arbitrary thing. There is no law in the universe that says God has to do it that way. He did it on purpose to tell us something about what? The 6 days? No! To tell us about the Sabbath day. There's this artificial construct of creation that's communicated to us in Genesis that has 6 days in one. Why? Because of the one. It's that important. It's so important that everything you see that God created, he decided to communicate how it happened in the construct of a 6-1. Why? Because Sabbath and rest is in his top tier list of important things. From the creation of the universe. Nobody is out there debating. I haven't seen this yet. They're debating about the age of the universe and it's a day in the creation. Everyone's debating that. No one's saying, why did he do it that way? And why did he do the seventh day? Does God need to rest because he gets tired? No. Well, then why did he do it? No one's wrestling with that. And that's what I've been wrestling with my entire life as a believer. Why that seventh day? Why the model for us doing that is the rhythm of life in our week? And why? Why is rest so important? Okay, so I hope at this point we've piqued your curiosity because it's clearly a top-tier list for God. It seldom is a top-tier list for us. Now, before we go on and try and look at what rest really is, because I think we have a misunderstanding, we all are on the side of being pro-rest, especially after a week of EBS. Yes, we are all pro-rest. No one argues with that. So why is it that we don't do it when we're so pro it? Well, we sort of do it. with the same kind of importance as the top tier issue God does? No. Maybe that's because I'm misunderstanding what it is. Maybe I need to elevate it some. If they went into captivity for 70 years because of it, I think it's probably a big issue. Rest. We are all pro-rest. And yet the reality is that we don't do it too well. Let's look at what it is for a second, because I think we misunderstand what it is. Let me take you to Exodus 33. This is a great example, a nice kind of unfolding of what goes on. So Exodus 33, Exodus 32, the chapter before. You know what's famous in Exodus 32? What happened in Exodus 32? That's when Moses is up on the mountaintop and they do the golden calf thing on the bottom. And at the end of chapter 32, everyone is disgusted. God's disgusted. Aaron's disgusted. Moses is disgusted. The people are disgusted. I mean, it's chapter 32 is like the bottom of the curve for Exodus. I mean, it's the worst. It's the golden calf episode. Then you turn the page into Exodus 33, and that's what we're going to look at. So that's the context. This is an important context. So at the top of 33, it's funny to me. You go read it actually, because 32 and 33 together they're a good read. But in 33 in the beginning, God goes to Moses and he says, "Look, it's time for you guys to leave Sinai, Mount Sinai. It's time for you guys to leave Mount Sinai, and you need to go into the land, head north, go into the land. It's time to leave this place," because they were at Mount Sinai a long time. Chapter 33, so it's time to leave. Let's go up there. But, and here's the big but God says to Moses, "I'm not going with you." It's there in Exodus 30. I'm not going with you. And why? I'll tell you why. Because if I went with you, I would consume you, because you're a stiff-necked people. I'm not going. You guys go, but I'm not going with you. God makes that declaration beginning of chapter 33. Can you believe that? Go, but I'm not going with you. Because you know what? If I went with you, I would destroy all of you. Oh my gosh. What? That's what happens a breath before this passage I'm going to read. Is that God says, "You're out of here. I'm not going with you." And of course, Moses' jaw is just slack. Like, well, then why were we up on this mountain getting the 10 Commandments? I mean, what? Okay, now listen for the rest word. This is Exodus, over here, Exodus 33, I'm sorry. So this is Moses pleading with God. By the way, it's a wonderful scene there where there's a tent of meeting, where Moses goes out to talk with God, and Moses goes into the tent. God comes in his Shekinah glory, kind of blocks the exits, and has a talk with Moses. And it says right there in the beginning of 33, Moses used to go talk to God like a friend. They would have these talks. So here's that talk going. Here's the actual text of one of those talks when God says, "I'm not going with you." So 33:12. So Moses said to the Lord, "See, you say to me, Moses saying, 'Bring up this people,' but you've not let me know whom you will send with me." Like, if God's not going, who is going to go with me? You haven't told me who's going to go with me. Yet you've said, "I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight." See what Moses is saying? I'm supposed to take the people up there, but who's going to go with me? I mean, who's going to help me in this whole process? And it says that you know me, you even know my name, but that doesn't seem to have any merit on the whole fact of whether you're going to go with me. I found favor in your sight. Okay, but I'm still feeling alone now. You've called me to a task I've got to do alone. 13. Now, therefore, Moses says, "Therefore, if I have found favor in your sight," like you like me, right, God? If I found favor in your sight, I mean, please show me now your ways. I'm stuck. That I may know in order to find favor in your sight. I mean, and consider too that this nation is your people. Don't abandon us now. And then God says in 14, this is amazing. "My presence will go with you, and I'll give you rest." My presence will go with you, and I'll give you rest. My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And Moses said, "Look, if your presence will not go with me, don't bring us up from here. If your presence will not go with me, then don't bring us up from here. For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, and I in your people? I mean, is it not in your going with us, so that we are distinct, I and your people, from every other people on the face of the earth? Isn't the fact that you're with us that makes us different from everyone else? So Moses appeals to God, and God relents, says, okay. But you got to listen to the words, because this is how we understand rest better. God says, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. Well, now, when I consider what happens after this in the narrative, they spend a generation in the desert. They're really not at rest. They go into the land. They're really not at rest. I mean, they're killing people, and they're moving out pagans and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's hard work. I mean, they're clearly not sitting on their hands. But God says, my presence will be with you and you'll find rest. So here's the question we can figure out about rest. What is it about God's presence as they went through all that turmoil of moving into the land that brought them rest while they were busy inhabiting the land? So clearly, rest is not inactivity. And that's one of the first things we get wrong about rest. Rest is not inactivity. It's something else. It's something that comes from the presence of God. That even in the midst of when the Israelites are busy fighting and moving into the promised land, God's presence gives them rest in the midst of all that activity. So that's the number one thing I think we get wrong about rest. I mean, we understand rest. For us, it's laying on the couch for a Sunday afternoon. That's rest. That's clearly inactive. At least for me, it is inactive. It's clearly inactive. But rest from God's perspective is bigger than that. There's something about God's presence, like he says to Moses, that will bring you rest in the midst of all that action. So could it be that rest is something that has more to do with soulish issues rather than physical issues? This is why this is a fascinating topic to look at. Moses could actually tell you that as he's going into the land, I've been at rest because God's with us. Wait. Say that again. I've been at rest because God's with us. Now, he's not at rest at the beginning of 33 because God says, I'm not going with you. He wasn't at rest. He was stirred up. There was turmoil in his soul. But somewhere after that, when God agrees, well, my presence will go with you and you'll find rest. And by the way, when God says that to him, he says that to Moses. In a way, Moses is saying, come with me. If you won't come with the people because you're going to destroy them because you can't tolerate them, come because of me. Because that's what he says deliberately right there. If your presence will not go with me, then don't take us up there. So for Moses, the personal presence of God brought rest according to God's word, even in the midst of manic activity in the land. I think it is more of a soulish thing. I think it's more of an attitude of the heart thing. I mean, you can go in and you can shoulder responsibilities, like many of us shouldered responsibilities for VBS this week, and it was busy. It never stopped being busy. But there's a sense in which in the midst of that busyness, you can say to yourself, wait a second, God's here, his presence is here, and I'm at rest while I'm busier than I've been for weeks. You see, the concern of your heart is there. That's what's being illustrated, and not so much the physical activity. It's something that you normally shoulder in terms of anxiety and concern and responsibility, that you can actually let that rest while you're still busy. The presence of God is here, I can rest. But I'm still going to be busy. And I think when you start to go that route, you start to understand what God's intention for rest is. Okay? Because, for instance, he says over and over again that when the Israelites come into the promised land, he uses the word, this metaphor, when you're there, you will find rest. Well, even after they conquer the peoples, even after they're living there, I mean, they still have to till fields. I mean, there's work, there's busyness in the land, but God calls that place rest. It's not inactivity. It's something else. It's something about the presence of God that calms your heart in the midst of activity and says, the presence of God brings me rest. There's also an issue about agrarian economies that we don't understand anymore, and I touched on it a little bit. If your crops fail, it actually threatens your family. Your kids may not eat. It's a really tough thing. It's actually a terror. It's a terror is what it is. And so even though you work really hard to get these crops so your family can eat, you're constantly under this terror of your heart and this concern and anxiety of your mind that I must succeed at this or people that I love will die. And that terror is a huge weight. It's a huge weight. Well, what we're talking about, in fact, is that weight can be laid down in the presence of God. Your success in growing your crops is not as important as the presence of God is in feeding your family. So now we get the understanding that what's going on here, rest is something about who I put my trust in. Do I put my trust in myself to grow my wheat and my barley this year so my kids won't starve next year? Or do I put my trust in God himself? I'll still work the fields. I'll still till the fields. I'll plant everything. I'll put the fertilizer. I'll do all that kind of stuff. But the success of what happens and what keeps my family alive is not principally about me being successful. It's about God as our Father being someone who provides for us. That now we're getting toward the rest side, because as you look forward to have hope, it's not really dependent on your success at what you do today, whether you have hope for tomorrow. It has everything to do with God being faithful to us. And in that sense, your heart can rest. You'll still be physically active, but that burden can be laid down. And so what God was saying when they went in the promised land was, look, you can go there and you'll be busy in the land. You'll be growing crops in the land. You'll be using vineyards you didn't plant. You'll be in houses you didn't build. I mean, you're still going to be busy. You're going to be growing crops. But you know what? In terms of whether your family will survive next year or not, it has less to do about you being successful and has everything to do about the fact that I am your God and your Father, and you can trust me. Now, this is how you can take a seventh day off when the grasshoppers are coming in town. Why in the world would you take a day off, sit in the shade, sip your mint juleps, and say, oh, the crops will be okay, and you can hear the grasshoppers eating your hard work? How can you do that? Well, you say to your children, honey, it'll be okay. God said he gave us the luxury of this time off, and you know who's got that problem today? God's got that problem. It's trust. And what happens in your soul? You rest. So rest seems to be really tightly coupled to who you trust. If you put your trust too much in yourself, in terms of determining the future, it will always be a terror to you, especially when you think about the ones you love in your family. It'll always be a terror to you. I must produce. I must succeed. I must do this or everything will fall apart. But the people of God say, nope, God's got this. I'll still be diligent. I'll plant crops. But in the end, this is God. Now God put this, he also designed this in the system about where he put them in the promised land. Because he said, look, you all came out of Egypt. Where does all the crop water come from in Egypt? The Nile. Woohoo! And you irrigate from the Nile. Woohoo! And the entirety of the success of the crops in Egypt has to do with how you irrigate from the Nile. The Nile is everything. That's why they had gods to the Nile. But I'm going to put you in a different kind of place, God says. When I put you in the promised land, I'm going to put you in a place where there's really almost no rivers. There's no Nile equivalent where I'm going to put you. In fact, normally, like you see this in Utah here, you put a community at the base of a mountain that has a river coming through it because there's a water source right there. That's where you put it. God says, nah, we're not going to do that for Israel. We're going to put you on the top of the mountain rather than the bottom of the mountain where the streams come out. And on the top of the mountain, you're going to have to rely on the rains from heaven and the dew from heaven. He said deliberately. So, if you're a really good farmer and you're still planting and you're still tilling the soil and you do everything that you do responsibly to protect the life of your family, still, what are you going to do about controlling the rain? Nothing. And God says, yeah, that's on purpose. I want you to realize that I bring the rains, I bring the blessing, I bring the wonderful dew in the morning. You're still going to have to rely on me. So it turns out that feeding your family in Israel was a partnership with God. You can plant the fields. You can harvest the crops. God brings the rain. Without God, it doesn't succeed. So even in the very nature of the agrarian economy in Israel, the idea was you need to trust in me. And if you stand there worrying about whether or not storms are going to come or whether or not rains are going to come, you can stand on the horizon and look for the clouds. Chill. God brought us here. He's our God. We're his people. Rains will come. Rest. Fifi, just a little later, okay? Hold on to that thought. I'm glad you're thinking. So this is what rest is. Rest seems to be fundamentally about trust in God. Fundamentally. Because what keeps us all from resting, if you're like me, is the burden of what you have to accomplish won't let you go to sleep. That's what keeps you from resting. What keeps you from resting? You keeps you from resting. You keeps you from resting. What enables rest? Trusting God and saying, I'm going to take those things and I'm going to let them go. And we are such work animals. From the very creation of the universe, God said, I want you to live one day a week where you don't work at all. You can place all those concerns down. You can relax. You can let your heart rest and say, God's got this today. And why? Because he's not a distant God. He's a God who's present with us. And so that's why God said in Exodus 33 to Moses pleading, my presence will go with you and you'll find rest. Why? Because I'm here. So the question to us is he here with us? Is he near to us? And his nearness to us, why doesn't that elicit more rest in our lives? Well, because in the responsibilities we have in life, we forget about the fact that God's there to provide for us at the same time we're busy. God uses our busyness, that's the partnership. But in the end, the outcome is his. We can rest because of that. One more passage, because I think this is just a beautiful thing. Hebrews 4. Hebrews 4, by the way. Hebrews 4. We went through Hebrew many years ago. The topic of rest comes up in Hebrews quite a lot. And in context of talking about the narrative about the Israelites and also us. But do you know in chapter 4 of Hebrews, the word rest is used 8 times? 8 times. So if you want to go to the New Testament source about, okay, I don't think I understand what rest is, I'll go to Hebrews 4. So I just brought out one verse from that. And this is an astonishing thing because this really bridges the fact that the rest that was intended for the nation of Israel as they came into the land, because God was their God and they were his people, that rest because he'll provide, the outcome is on his shoulders, not on your shoulders. Hebrews says we can live the same way. So he says in Hebrews 4:8, look, if Joshua had given them rest, that is when Joshua brought them into the land, if Joshua had given them rest with a capital R, then God would not have spoken of another day later on, another day of rest. So they did find rest when they came in the promised land, but that wasn't the end of the capital R rest promise. There's more to it, he says. In verse 9, so then, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever, here's the key, whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works, as God did from his. I mean, let that sink in for a second. Have we found our rest? Yeah. Anyone who's entered God's rest has already rested from his works, as God has from his. And so when we talk about salvation, we talk about the fact that it's a gift of God. It's grace. And Paul says in Ephesians 2, it's not on the basis of your works, lest anyone boast. It's a gift of God. It's a gift of God. So when you look at that Ephesians 2, when you look at Hebrews here, what he's saying is we enter the rest of God when we put aside our attempts to earn his favor on our behalf by working. You can just swap the word work for earning right there. When we put those aside. So he says you have entered that same rest. And it's a rest that goes past the rest that Joshua promised them when they went into the promised land. It's a rest like right now. But that rest really depends on you taking the trust off of yourself and placing it on God and saying, I'm going to stop working to earn your favor, God. I'm going to stop working to ensure my future. I instead am going to rest by trusting you. And everyone who has put down their works and trusted God has entered his rest. And that's us. If you've given your life to Jesus, that's us. So wait a second. There's a much more important point that comes out of this. If indeed we have entered God's rest, the Sabbath rest that the writer of Hebrews says has been promised to us, that's bigger and better than the promised rest of going to the promised land. And if we've entered that rest, once we've laid those things down and stopped working to try and please God, and we trust him instead, then does that mean that once I became a believer and put my trust in God, that I have entered a state of rest, which is not just on Saturday or Sunday, but it starts now and goes on eternally? This is where this topic gets really fascinating. For those who've come to God, who've accepted the message of salvation from Jesus, they enter a promised land of rest that starts the moment you give your life to him, and from that point forever forward. How long did God's seventh day of creation last? The seventh day of rest, I'm sorry. It doesn't have an end. You read it. Go back to Genesis. It doesn't have an end. You got day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They all come to an end. Day 7 starts and never ends. And it's a wonderful way in which God, from the very opening chapters of Genesis, says, I've set this day apart so that I can find rest with you. It's as though God's saying, I have a Saturday of rest, I have a Sabbath of rest, and anyone who comes to me and puts their trust in me enters an eternally long day of rest in the presence of God. In the Christian mindset, rest is not a once a week thing. It's an everyday thing. So the Sabbath itself, the set apart day, is today and tomorrow and the day after. It's any day in which you practice the presence of God. That's your Sabbath rest. And that's what God has been trying to say since Genesis. And I would go as far as this, since we're running out of time. I'd go as far as this. When God created everything and he has this seventh day, which has no end, it's his way of saying, through the example of creation, that I've created all this for the purpose of having this time of rest where I can be in the presence of my people and my people can be in my presence, and that starts now and goes eternally. If, according to Hebrews, you've laid down your works and you've trusted him instead. That's the big picture of rest. So in a sense, you could say that rest itself is our state after we come to Jesus. After we find salvation, our life is rest. Well, I don't know about my life and your life, but I had a pretty busy week last week. I wouldn't characterize that by rest. Yeah, but is God's presence with you? And has he taken off your shoulders the responsibility and the anxieties and the terror of having to succeed? Well, I guess I took that on myself. Well, put that down. And in the presence of God, you can say, God's the one who provides for us. He's the one that ensures our well-being. He's the one that brings us hope, not us performing well. I think in the modern culture, when we put so much weight on performing well, we forget about the fact that there is a God who's near, who has guaranteed your future because of his love and not because of your performance. Right? That's the heart of the gospel, and that's the heart of rest. Life with God is a life of rest. And God says all the way throughout the entire Old Testament narratives, he says, here's my hope for you, Israel. Here's my hope. That at one point we can say this, I'll be your God and you will be my people. That's the offer to all mankind. I'll be your God, you'll be my people. And in saying that, we invoke the great loving nature of God, and that loving nature that's manifest in his provision for us and his protection for us and all that goes with all of that. God just pled with them all along. I just want to be your God if you'll be my people. That's all I really want. And when they violated that before they went to Babylon, they said, well, you're not our God and we're not your people. God says, great. Have a good time in Babylon until you figure this out. Trusting in God is how we find rest. I would encourage you to go back and read Hebrews 4. Because he says also quite explicitly that they did not enter their rest of going into the promised land because of disobedience. What was their disobedience? They didn't believe God at his word when God said, there's life here that I'll provide for you. And they disobeyed. And so the writer of Hebrews says, so that's really our problem. When we start losing our rest, it's because we put our trust in ourselves and we have disbelieved that God himself can provide for us. And so we go off on our own and do our own thing. And we're terrorized by our lack of rest. And that's exactly what the Israelites did when they came knocking on the edge of the promised land. Oh, big giants. Don't think we can do this. God promised the place to us, but I don't know. Don't think we can take them. And they know about the Red Sea. Can't take them. They didn't enter the land. They didn't enter rest because they disbelieved the character of God and his promises. And that's exactly what we do unconsciously when we slip into non-rest, when we slip into being terrorized by those things. we start forgetting about the character of God, and we start trusting ourselves instead of trusting God. So rest is not inactivity. Rest is the state of the heart in trusting in God. Rest is trusting in the outcome based on his loving kindness toward us. Rest is an attitude, let's say it's a posture of the soul of contentment in a God who promises his love to us. That's what rest is. That's what rest is. Yes, peace I give to you. That's what rest is. And that's why God had to make an example of the Israelites and take them into captivity, because you never let the land rest. Rest is an important deal to God. And rest is the presence of God. That's why it's important. That's why it's important. The presence of God and the outcome in your life. Father, we pray you'd give us more understanding with your Spirit. And Father, we ask your forgiveness for those times that we take on ourselves, take on our shoulders things that we shouldn't, because we just believe that you're trustable and that you've got it, that you even see it, that you'll even engage for our good. And Lord, we don't ask to be inactive. We love when you use us. We love when we're engaged for the gospel and telling the good news about who you are. We love doing that kind of stuff. Lord, we love doing that through VBS this week and all the business of that, and kids who heard truth in ways they've never heard truth before. God, we love being active for you, and we know that you've made us for good works, according to Ephesians 2:10. You've made us for that. But God, protect our hearts from taking on ourselves the responsibility of only what you can guarantee for us, that you have promised to give to us. Forgive us when we start looking to ourselves rather than looking to you. You're the God who loves us tremendously. We know in the Psalms that your love is everlasting. Your love goes through and beyond not only our times of sin, but our times of weakness. Your love is everlasting. It does not stop. So Lord, forgive us when we forget that and we take on ourselves the responsibility of what only you can do. So thank you for these words. Be our rest. And again, God, we thank you for the reminder of this place and the rest that is so natural here. That is very clearly the result of your loving hand. So we thank you now in Jesus' name. Amen.